Sampling has always been a bit of a problem in that it is very difficult to pick a 20, 30 or so unit sample and find very much, especially if you're doing a recovery audit when the odds are against you finding anything. Now, when you look though from a scoring perspective and you start to look at transactions and find out how many reports are they showing up on and starting to identify items that have so many things wrong with them that they should be looked at, that has a higher chance. But let's kind of go through the sampling problem and what you find normally when you run a lot of reports. What you're going to find is that the tests for duplicates, round numbers, weekend entries, missing fields, you're going to get thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of transactions that are suspicious. And what we find is that out of every, let's say, if there's 500,000 transactions, 100,000 of which are going to show up on some report somewhere. Now, before we showed a case study where there are percentages that can go up to 0.1% and 0.07%, if we even say that 0.02 or 0.03% of all transactions have real problems, such as a recovery, and do some simple math here, what you end up finding is that you have a 1 in 800 chance of ever finding anything. So imagine throwing a random dart at 800 balloons hoping to hit the right one. That tends to be what sampling is if it doesn't start to do things like scoring and stratification, etc. Unless those things are brought into the sampling, it's just a random sample, you have a very, very low chance of ever finding anything wrong. So as an example, we may use scoring to improve a duplicate payment test. We may want to look for the type of duplication and prioritize ones that are, let's say, the same invoice number, same amount, same vendor, that is such a perfect duplicate. We may want to say that that's very high on the list. We may want to look for vendors that are also duplicated and relate that to the duplicate payments. We may want to see if it was paid on a different check, paid by a different person. So enterer 1 and enterer 2 both entered the same invoice. That has a higher chance of duplication. So these are all things that you can do to score the activity, and hence you have a much better chance of finding something wrong. What it boils down to is creating a single score for every transaction, depending on how many attributes that transaction meets. So you decide how many reports we want to run, what are the reports that lead to quote-unquote weird situations, and then we're going to transactionally test and look on severity how many transactions hit those reports that you cared about. We'll then summarize it, scatter graph it, and we'll show you some examples of that. I always like to take a look at it as summarizing on various perspectives: who, what, when, where, and why, and taking that journalistic approach to this summary process. Who, vendors, employees, customers, what are we looking for? Maybe a size or a growth rate over a time period. And from a why perspective, I always like to think about the likelihood of occurrence as the why, the risk factor being the, why do we care? Why is this important? We can also summarize this by the various people in the process. So if we took a risk score for fraud and summarized by buyer and summarized by approver the transactions, we can actually start to figure out maybe collusion, where we can see a buyer associated with that vendor, associated with that invoice enterer, that over time if all of those scores show up high for each one of these people, we may want to do a combined query now that says, if the buyer is X and the vendor is Y and the invoice enterer is Z, let's pull those transactions because they have a high chance of working together to create these high-risk transactions. As I always like to graph, I find that in graphing, you can start to identify in a stratified way the scoring to the dollar amounts and see where do I want to spend my time. Do I spend my time on larger dollar vendors in this case that don't have a high score, or do I look at ones that have a high score but not as much in spend? What you can do is stratify, and you're able in this way, especially through this graph, to very quickly see high risk, high impact, and then stratifying and sampling vendors amongst here. This is also a great way to include this type of scatter graph along with your cost benefit or cost opportunity analysis that you may have done to determine where that interrelation is. Where do I have vendors that not only relate to a cost recovery category, but also have a high score when I'm looking, let's say, for fraud or error in my data? Another useful graph is just to look over time. How is spend increasing? Is it going up? In this case, the transactional score is going up over time. That's where the trend line is showing. But there are also days that have very, very high risk, and you may want to take a look or sample activity on those days versus on others. One last approach is maybe graphing the information by where those vendors end up. In this case, we're looking at values in this graph, but it could be by risk score, and we can determine which vendors have the highest score and what part of the country or world are they showing up in. That also is a key indicator for a fraudulent vendor, but also a hot pocket of fraud activity. So to summarize on the transactional score benefits, what you're trying to do is find the best sample items so that if you do pick a 50-unit sample, it's going to meet the duplicate payment test and the round dollar test and the in-sequence test, just because mathematically they have all of these attributes. And I think it's a great way, it's a diligent approach to performing your audit, because it becomes a consistent way in how you're selecting transactions, as opposed to it being judgmental, which again, judgment should be a part of every audit and every auditor, but I think to have a consistent methodology of how you select things can also be very valuable, that you can add your judgment to and modify and change over time, but again, consistently applied, you're going to have better results.